Hey everyone, and welcome to another Awakening from the Meaning Crisis Discord Q&A. This is part 3 of our trilogy through NickB's journey, or his tale of intrigue, and through his life in 4 cults. And he's taken us through quite a bit, and now today we're going to be focusing on, I guess, the do's and don'ts of how to if you're gonna have a cult, how to have a good cult. So I'll pass it. I'll pass it to you, Nick.
Great. Yeah. So we ran through a couple of these tenets at the end of the last video. And perhaps we can just kind of go through them as they come up instead of listing it, kind of like I did last time as I was rushing. Yeah, so I maybe a good starting point would be dealing with arguably the two traits that come up most obviously when we think of the word cult, kind of its popular image within the culture, and that's generally narcissism and authoritarianism. So those are like the big, when you hear the boogeyman word of cult, it's generally you're thinking of an extraordinarily narcissistic leader that has an extreme authoritarian rule over the group of people that they've convinced of whatever. So part of, when I make arguments in this realm has been, part of my argument against why cult is not a particularly useful word is because a lot of really good work has been done on these qualities in other fields, and everything you can learn from those applies directly to these larger group situations or even small, just group situations. And so I don't think it's actually doing very much to use the word cult as a normative boundary in that sense. Instead, it's a lot more useful for a person to move the normative boundary to the descriptor. So, right, oh, this is a narcissistic cultic structure, can give someone more tools because they know what narcissism is, whereas the word cult is too fuzzy and kicks in someone's defensive reactions, perhaps. So in that regard, a book that I found very useful was Daniel Shaw's Traumatic Narcissism. And then I forget the subtitle. It's like Systems of Subjugation or something like that. But he gives an interesting frame because he kind of stacks it. He starts from an individual personal relationship layer of dealing with narcissism and narcissistic parents or close people in your family, and then he kind of builds it up from there, looking at how that narcissistic quality can develop into these larger systems. And one of the chapters is devoted to his time in a cult that was based in Hinduism, although he never actually says which one it was. So yeah, this is really tricky, a really tricky aspect of this scenario as well, because narcissism has gone so wildly out of control. Like, it's just the normal mode of behavior now to be extraordinarily narcissistic. Like, that's what social media is. It fosters extreme narcissism. Just in the sense of attention seeking, and then the distorted sense that forms when you have a system where you have an audience and a performer. Right, that scenario leads very deeply to narcissistic seeking. A lot of this also comes from the mechanism by which we validate our identities. So like narcissism is also a necessary and healthy quality of what it means to be a person. So learning kind of like how to properly contextualize narcissism, why it exists, and then how it can go kind of sliding into you know, the familiar nasty territory. All of that is very important to get a handle on. And again, I would say probably now more so than ever, because of its extreme prevalence. But right, it's you know, being an Instagram or a YouTube star or whatever, like all of this is the beginnings of just classic narcissistic cultic structures forming around individuals, and it's often in ways that we're not entirely familiar with because we're also used to, with the word cult or you know, a thought leader or whatever, we're often used to the isolationist quality that's easy to point out in the physical world and really hard to point out in the digital world. Hard because generally people will self-enclose in a echo chamber or kind of thought bubble. It's usually completely open to anyone that wants to go and look at what's happening there. Like there's very little boundaries most of the time. So yeah, I don't know. It's missing a lot of the qualities that normally set off our red flags, right? Even this group, not to be too harsh here, but right, one of the barriers of entry is having watched 50 hours of one guy's lecture series. Granted, you can come in and have conversations without that, but it will be reinforced by the people that if you want to deeply partake in the conversations we're having here, that's kind of like a standard requirement. And that's going, you know, I don't know, it's the potential for that type of thing to start forming into personality cults is you know, very easy, and you see it with anyone else, you know, Jordan Peterson or I don't know, I'm picking certain people here, but that people would be familiar with. But you know, it's possible with literally anybody nowadays. But I'm wandering a bit here. Learn about narcissism is the main point there, and then that learning is very useful because it applies in every social circumstance in which you'll encounter it, rather than trying to use a lens that's not particularly helpful of trying to do the normative boundary policing of what is a cult and what isn't. So that was a nice 10-minute rant. I don't know if anyone has comments on narcissism.
I have a comment. So I do agree with you on narcissism as part of the cult, kind of the standard cult understanding. What my experience was that I've seen in my experience with the cult, like the destructive one I've been in, I noticed that there are people who are like overt narcissists, but also there are people who are kind of covert narcissists, like, or they are so traumatized that they are like trauma bonding or whatever the term is. I'm not a psychologist, but
right.
Essentially, like, it becomes kind of stable system in a way. And also some of the people who are not overt narcissists, they are actually kind of aspiring to become like the next leader of some sort. That's my kind of, I can't prove it, but it was my feeling. Does it match your intuition?
Yes, and I think getting like a clear handle on the whole the work that's been done on narcissism is helpful because it pops us out of our classic training the really overt signs of narcissism that most people can recognize. And it gets a lot more refined. And one of the comments, perhaps to your point that I said I think in the last one, was about how naivety is a form of like most of what fuels naivety is narcissism. And having this kind of yeah, you're exactly right. There's a very bizarre effect where our own sense of narcissism makes us way more likely to be manipulated by another narcissist, because in some sense we are realizing our dream through that person. We are projecting it, and we'll subjugate ourselves with the dream that will be the mighty narcissist at some later point. So that
maybe
our own narcissism can work against us in multiple ways in that regard. One is the projecting onto the person what we want to be, and then the other is just opening us up to levels of manipulation that you would not necessarily be as open to without a culture-wide emphasis on narcissistic behavior.
And following up on this, I have this observation that the cults have this kind of, narcissistic cults, as you call them. They have this weird usefulness, because a person can go on being manipulative or whatever, or not aware, delusional, narcissistic, whatever you want to call it, until they actually hit a more sophisticated narcissist, which is usually a cult leader. Right. And then they hit the wall, and this becomes kind of a realization in a way.
Right.
But sometimes it ends badly, but sometimes it's just an awakening moment, in a way.
Oh,
and they start to see their own narcissism. So in this respect, it's kind of weirdly useful.
Right. It's an important point to bring up, right? It's like, just because a system is relatively horrifying does not mean people are not learning a great deal from it.
Yeah.
And part of that confusion can be used against, it can be used within a cultic structure. So, there's always learning to be had from whatever bad circumstances we happen to find ourselves in.
Okay.
But we should, ideally, if we're consciously going into a situation like in this group where people are trying to design a religion, I think it's probably helpful to have a very clear idea of how very wrong those things can go.
Yeah.
Well, also, your good intentions don't protect you from anything at all, right? Every cult I've been in had legitimately, honestly good intentions. So that's part of that naivety, right? It's like, you're not
but that's a good point. Like, how groups of people do get delusional as well as individuals. Right. I find that fascinating.
Right. What I noticed as well was like a very slow slide from the means are more important to the ends justify the means. And it was not obvious where the switch happens. So there's just this slow movement, right? Especially if your means are not performing as well as you would hope, then there's just this like keep your eye on the prize thing that starts popping up, and then eventually you'll realize that you're willing to sacrifice more and more for the accomplishment of that goal, until you end up in a full, arguably heavily delusional state.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah.
I have a question. So, regarding confirmation bias and then the replication crisis in psychology, do you think it's hard to use psychological theories as concrete models?
As concrete models? Absolutely. I think they can still be very helpful for training a person's salience. But every time I read, especially psychoanalysis, which is like a weird-ass branch of psychology, I take it with a huge grain of salt, and I try and make use of it and, allow it to inform my own experiences on things. But I try not to just... I don't know. The hard sciences are a lot easier to let them impact me more than the soft sciences. And one should be, I think, deeply skeptical.
Just to draw off that, when you talked about branding and kind of internalizing whatever that brand or identity might be, I'm worried about with psychology, whatever pop theory might be relevant at the time, it might make your salience landscape identify with whatever is popular in the theory. And so something like Christianity being popular, and that's like the supernatural model of the universe, and you internalize that, like that's not going to be, accurate. And so regarding that, I'm not really sure if it's a good idea to model your salience landscape based on something that we don't know exists in any real sense.
I would agree. However, I would say that, again, we end up cutting a balance between two dangers. One is like, you can't throw away all your sense-making tools because they're fuzzy. And then at the other end, you can't take them too seriously because they are fuzzy.
Well, that's pretty broad in general, because psychology is just one field of science, and it's not even a fully accurate or fully replicable field yet. And so that would be like saying, we can't throw away Christianity's supernatural claims because they help us make sense of the world. I think it's misleading.
I guess, yeah. I mean, looking at the work, in many ways, then it's like, why listen to what anyone has to say?
Well, if there's evidence, then that's a good start. If there's replication, that's a good start. I'm just speaking because you're talking about narcissism, which is a theoretical model in psychology, and then psychology isn't. Like, it would be like if you're trying to scientifically prove astrology, for example, and then there was no evidence, and I said, well, maybe this isn't the best way for us to look at astronomy through the lens of astrology, for example.
So would you say that we should be looking at neuroscience?
I wouldn't be making any prescriptive claim beyond the claim I just made, just because I don't know. I don't know like how to deal with this idea of the cult. I'm not even fully sure what it entails, because you've brought up the history of how the words have changed, and so I'm trying to get the general pattern. I guess when you bring up narcissism as the general theme, or a general theme, it becomes even cloudier, just because the theory might not even be accurate to human nature.
I mean, yeah. I agree. And yet, it seems fairly obvious that there are healthy and unhealthy personality types, and we've classified a certain class of them under a term that has an arguable basis for where it arises from. And yet it seems fairly obvious when one is interacting with an extreme narcissist that something is wrong.
Well, I do have objections, but I don't want to take over the conversation, so I'll allow someone else to make a question or conjecture.
I can add that there is something called dark triad, which is more generic term than just narcissism, and there are scales in experimental psychology how they measure it. So it's not completely theoretical. There is some kind of statistical evidence.
Right. Well, and part of the problem is that it's statistical evidence. So you're within a field like with psychology, you're largely basing it off of an Overton window that you can't tell where it is on a objective scale. So you're establishing normal, and then you're judging things against whatever that idea of normal is.
Right, and that's where the confirmation bias comes in. But anyways, I like, if anyone else finds this like juicy, Yeah,
an important point.
I just
and
don't want to
yet
take
we
over the
can't-
conversation.
I think it would be not a good move to just go, all of it is meaningless. Makes sense.
No, I'm not saying that. I'm saying it's not proven, and so to use it as if it was proven is misleading.
Right. Well, and yeah, that's why I was hedging everything with the, take it with a grain of salt. You have
Okay,
to use
well,
it.
fair enough.
Use it to help
That's
you
perfect.
inform your own experience. I'm not saying psychology is a perfect field by any stretch of the imagination.
That
And
answers my question.
psychoanalysis, which is where Daniel Shaw is writing, is arguably way sketchier than even the larger category of psychology.
Okay, thanks, man.
But the group sense making of a lot of other people does help. Just, yes, be skeptical, keep a certain layer of your autonomy.
Right on.
Manuel, did you have something? I cut you off there at one point.
Oh, I just wanted to say, right, when we cordon off an area, right, then we might not have the exact area cordoned off, but there's still an area, right? Like if it's a little bit larger or a little bit smaller, it doesn't matter, right? Like we're still describing a thing. And I think that's important to notice in the narcissism part, right? Like we might not be accurate, but we are accurate enough to talk about a real thing.
Well, and I don't think we shouldn't lose focus that you weren't talking just about narcissism, but narcissism with totalitarianism and authoritarianism. That there are a lot of narcissists out there who don't, just impose their will on a group, and have
well,
their will
usually
enforced.
they'll
I just isolated narcissism just as a psychological theory. That's all.
Right. And it is if you do look into the work a little bit, like it's not just bad. It's part of identity formation and how one, narcissism is the appropriate response to realizing one's size in the universe. I've heard one person say.
Interesting.
Psychologist, right? It's how you make it's in some very deep sense what is protecting you from nihilism. So, again, it's probably a lot more helpful to speak in terms of what does a healthy narcissistic attitude look like and what does a unhealthy one look like. And authoritarianism might be one aspect we bring in to look at how narcissism can be very damaging when it's taken out of a certain circumstance or pushed too far in a certain way. All right, let's see. Are we good on should we bring some other stuff in here?
Yep.
Yes, please.
This one I brought up last time too, the bait and switch of surrender and to submission. This one's exceptionally common for getting people through the door, and kind of altering their normal sense. So, in any type of transformative practice, now we're looking at a very specific subset of cultic structures that this group that we're in is specifically aimed towards, which is how do you transform people. The word cult also applies to political projects and many other things. But this one is really pretty tricky because I think it's damn near impossible for a person to, within themselves, identify meaningfully the difference between surrender and submission at a phenomenological level. And I can say that from my own personal experience, it was having an experience of surrender that was not oriented towards any person that opened me up for confusing it with submission. and chasing after the experience of surrender through submission, which was, again, I'm relying on a psychoanalyst's work here, Emmanuel Gent, Ghent. Yeah, in some deep sense, it's like upon realizing the deep relaxation of sleep, you smash yourself in the head with a hammer to try and replicate it. And that obviously has negative consequences. This one's really tricky, and especially because part of Vervaeke's project in particular is reintroducing the communal aspect of the kind of transformative project, which has largely been stripped away in a good number of the secular projects that have made it into the West that are spiritual in some sense, right? So spirituality in the West has, through the New Age, kind of taken on this tone of like your personal journey, and then it falls into this autodidactism that Vervaeke critiques rightly. And then the problem is that it's putting us back in the dangerous position of how do you find something that is worth your surrender, and probably more familiar, to phrase it in a more familiar sense, what's something that's worthy of your submission. So right, I'll try and pull it to an example that is hopefully less contentious than transformation in a spiritual sense. Why is a college worth you submitting to? Right, and it's created all the. I mean, you're literally paying enormous amounts of money to be properly brainwashed, and then by being properly brainwashed, you are affording yourself the ability to offer more value to the people around you. Right, this is the college system, and ideally, you also feed that value back into the college system itself by making advancements in the field. But right, it's well known, confirmation bias among them, that it requires us to be taught a certain mimetic structure in order to even have a chance at coming to valuable or pseudo-objective information. Right, it takes a lot of work of reframing how the human mind normally operates to try and cleanse it of its normal issues. So, right, we often, perhaps more relevant culturally as well, as we can see what happens when a trusted structure like a college, which is in the business of properly brainwashing people, allows things get into its system that are not healthy. So, right, people pay, whatever, their 80 grand for their degree, and then they get programmed into someone's pretty overt cultic system. And then they get a piece of paper saying this is what makes them valuable to the rest of the society. And you can end up very quickly in pretty serious issues. Now, all of those issues have been held at bay, largely from modernism's bend focus, and they're sliding out. And I would say that almost all of those mechanisms are non-existent for keeping it at some level of purity when you get into transformative practices, particularly when you move away from purity-oriented religious practices, because they do have a clear measuring standard. But when you get into stuff like Jung's integrating the shadow, or all these crazy wisdom, in many ways it's just guru gets to do whatever he wants, and it's your job to figure out how whatever the hell he happens to do is some great part of some great spiritual practice, right? That's a very dangerous position to be in. So you're trading between safety and effectiveness constantly here. Being an individualist is arguably safe. You might be extremely deluded, but at least you're deluded unto yourself and not onto a group of people. if you're going into a group situation, its ability to have a transformative effect is going to be way higher than your autodidactical process. But it's going to open you up for changes that are not guided by you and are arguably dangerous. And then when it gets into really effective spiritual practices, like integrating a shadow or, these darker, crazy wisdom type things, that have the potential to create transformation much more quickly, the danger level starts shooting through the roof. And usually people, especially in our cultural climate where we expect instantaneous return on our investment, it's really gonna, that's like a major thing to be really aware of. And there's dangers on the other side as well, like a purity culture. Now you have something to measure against. You can tell who's full of shit and who isn't. You also run into the normal, really deep dogmatic and fundamentalist attitudes that come with purity cultures. And you can often end up, especially in this circumstance, recreating the same thing you were trying to deal with. Or avoid. So there's dangers on every side here. I think probably, if we look at some of the examples of the systems that work the best in really heavy quotation marks here, creating systems that have numerous levels of checks and balances seems to be a clear, helpful quality. Sometimes that can undermine the authority, and then you end up in an infinitely fracturing system. That's almost like Protestantism, right? I don't know. It's just you're trading between variables constantly here, and perhaps what would be helpful is something like Vervaeke's ecology of practices, but for sociological structures, and kind of framing things from how do you keep this dynamic balance through multiple forms of practice, rather than isolating down to, there is health and here's exactly what it looks like type of formation. Anyone have ideas for dealing with that enormous cluster of problems? See, I don't have any answers here. It's just explorations and having witnessed how many different ways stuff can go sideways. So this is probably going to be very deeply unsatisfying.
Can you repeat that last part about healthy systems?
Right. So I was taking into account Vervaeke's ecology of practices, which is a way that he tries to avoid some of the issues that come up with older religious structures. And basically, just because you meditate does not mean you're not bullshitting yourself. Matter of fact, it greatly increases the chance that you will bullshit yourself. So how do you take a practice, make use of it without it creating the extreme propensity for bullshit? And so his answer was, well, if I balance meditation against this practice and this practice and this practice, they all kind of like dirty hands washing each other, have a greater chance to recognize and deal with the bullshit that comes out of one practice. It becomes revealed in another practice. So I was trying to use that as a metaphor for perhaps how we might create then, in that sense, how we are creating a healthy spiritual practice. I'm trying to extend that to how do we create a healthy spiritual community, or something like that.
So let's get,
Okay.
because John's 50 hours of video, one of his main reasons for that is, I think, to answer the question, how do you choose what you submit to? He wants to convince you that the things he's advocating for are justified based on science and history and philosophy, and rather than just saying, hey, do this because I tell you to.
Right. Right. The problem then is you end up in the postmodern critique of anyone can weave any story.
Well,
That's true.
or there could be multiple stories that lead to similar results, and I think that's fair. I don't
That
think
as well.
I don't think anyone here, or John especially, would say, "Hey, this is the only way to do it." You know, there's a bunch of different practices that achieve similar types of insight, you know, cultivation, and you know, he's not going to say, "Well, you have to do my way." If you do some other way, if it's shown to be effective, reliably effective, you know, he would say, "Hey, that's a great way too."
Right. So that might be considered one of those checks and balances, right? So what are you using to measure what success is? And then how open are you to having multiple pathways of success? I do think, again, you're constantly trading off between things, right? So when you open up yourself to that argument, you are likewise opening yourself up to a infinitely fragmenting culture that can't act until you kind of like settle back down to the individual, and it's just whatever works for the individual works, and that's all there is to it. And now you've lost the communal aspect, you've lost the wisdom transmission outside of what a person autodidactically picks up and says, I find use in this. Again, Protestantism is a useful example here, because you can like watch a unified religion fragment infinitely.
Nick, have you explored the institutional structures inside the church and how they keep healthy?
A little bit. You know, in the last talk, I used Orthodox Christianity as a good example of a system that has a hard in, easy out policy, and how that might work. So, right, anyone's allowed into the church to listen to any sermon or whatever. It's open in that sense, easy in, but it takes a lot of dedication and time and practice and interacting with the community until you're actually considered a member of the church.
Yeah,
right?
I
And
was
then you're
more
granted some title.
I was more referring to the ecology of practices for the institution.
The ecology of practices for the institution. Yeah, so I mean, it's much more clearly bound within a system like Catholicism. Like most of us are familiar with at least some of the rituals that are performed. And then when you get into Protestantism, it's basically whatever the hell, you know, there's some limitation based on the denomination you're claiming, but largely it's whatever the church wants to practice. Yeah.
So so you don't see any direct solutions or copy-pastable things? That's where I'm trying to go.
Do I see any direct No, I don't. Again,
Okay.
I'm trying to outline the problems to give a sense for the space to play in, and then ideally use examples of like, this seems to work better than this thing over here.
Yeah, I have a comment. So, when I got out of the cult, I worked with a few therapists, and I kind of got to see how the therapist community operates in the UK, at least. And they have a lot of checks and balances and supervision and institutions where they train and long program of training, and there is a lot of boundaries they have to follow and check. Like if they were teaching a student and then the student wants to get romantically involved with them, they have to wait for like 3 years before doing anything.
Right.
And even then they have to do it with their supervisor. And there is a lot of this stuff. Otherwise they are just kicked out and lose their accreditation.
Right.
And I wasn't aware of this before I started to do any self-development, let's say.
Yeah, I mean, it's... oh, sorry, continue.
I was surprised. I mean, they still go off at times, I feel it's a good kind of structure because it's not completely centrally authoritarian. It's more like collegial.
Right. Right, and I think that is very, like, having really clear boundaries is definitely a sign. You know, you need, especially when you're entering into such fuzzy territory.
Yeah.
It helps to have, like,
with a
clear...
narcissist, you need to have a clear boundaries, and so you need to be aware of your own boundaries, and this is the process of learning by bumping against narcissists.
Right. Right. Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that would probably, you know, incorporating stuff like that into something like a Ritnar would probably be extremely useful. You know, certainly having a deep awareness of how that whole scenario works. I do think there's an interesting trade-off. I don't know. I haven't actually seen any research on the subject, so it would be interesting because a guru-type figure is in many ways fulfilling the role of a therapist plus a lot more. And so it would be interesting to see people's experiences of transformation within themselves in therapy compared to various spiritually oriented or religiously oriented systems.
Yeah.
What would the lot more be? Oh, sorry, Alexi, go ahead.
Oh, and the follow-up on that. So after getting out of that cult, I spoke to a therapist who was at the same cult as me, but he went there deliberately to grow because it's like group work, and group work in therapy is the most efficient, provided there are good facilitators. And I asked him how does it work when the group therapy is really good, and he said in one case they had the situation where the facilitator was not strong enough, and essentially a few members of the group just kicked him out and continued. So they got for a retreat, and after a couple of days they decided that the facilitator is not good. He was out, and they continued and got to a good kind of place.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
Huh. Yeah.
So
yeah.
it's kind of distributed cognition, maybe, as
Right.
John puts it.
Right.
But then the people have to be kind of on a similar level.
Yes. Yeah. And you're gonna encounter the problem of like, how do you deal with people that are like seriously damaged and offer them something that is, you know, legitimately useful for them. Yeah. A lot of it's like, what's the scope of what your intention is?
Yeah, I'm just throwing
right?
this because...
Yeah, no, that's a good... Yeah. Didn't mean to, argue against it so much as nuance it a bit. Yeah, and Adam, your question, what's the a lot more? It would be, say, inducing religious experience, bringing a person into contact with some type of supernatural thing, offering a community, offering a communal structure, like the actual how the community itself operates. There's a lot that a guru can do that a therapist is more limited in ability. Largely because of the institutional structure, very often.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Do we have questions queuing up in event text?
There's a couple general questions, but I didn't know if you wanted to do those at the end as general ones or throughout.
Yeah, if they're general, then we can kind of keep pushing through. Let's see, we're at an hour already, so maybe... Oh, I wanted to keep this one a little bit shorter, hopefully, but we'll see. All right, let me try and make it a little bit further through the list and see where we end up. So yes, when you're dealing with transformative communities, as a very general rule, you need some mechanism for enabling surrender, and then to have a mechanism to account for the slide into submission. Last time I used the example of dialogos as a practice built to allow surrender, with ideally without allowing it to slide into submission, but the propensity is there, as some people commented watching some of Guy Sangstock's videos of circling. So right, it's ever present. But you're gonna have to figure out that calculus of putting someone in a state where they can, where transformation is afforded and not used against them, and that's hard to pull off. But we played around a little bit there with some ideas. And yes, the side effect of that is the more you move away from a system like Dialogos and closer into a system of like classic student-teacher dynamics, arguably the more effective the actual transmission will be, and the far more dangerous it will be, and it will have a much stronger propensity to become a submission-based system rather than a surrender-based system. How I'm using those words would probably be helpful to read Emmanuel Gent's paper on it. It's only like 15 pages. A lot of woo and funky stuff in there, but I think he is pointing towards something useful to pull apart. So yeah, a question that I saw come up in one of the other channels in here was people dealing with the issue of how do you pick a teacher, and it's this kind of endless chicken or egg problem of like only the wise recognize the wise, right? Like you can't actually pick a teacher unless you're already at the level of teaching. Otherwise, you are kind of blindly relying on some other structure's process in order to trust the information coming in, or you will be endlessly stuck in a combinatorial explosion, if you will. Use a Vervaekian term here. Yeah, go for it, Iron Root.
Oh no, I was just making the explosion.
Oh. So one of this is tying back into the narcissism from earlier as well, but you know, I think a mechanism that people are, or something people are looking for and have a really hard time getting a grasp of, is this difference between narcissistic power and ontological power. And they often look alike and have a really different phenomenology underlying them. So, right, to use classic religious examples, we can use the Buddha or Christ. Both of them could be described as extraordinarily narcissistic people. Right, one saying he is the Son of God, the other saying he is truly enlightened. You know, like extraordinarily narcissistic claims. But the larger question is not the immediate appearance, but what is the actual the ontological sense emanating from them. And compare it to someone like, say, Donald Trump, who is more familiarly putting out this sense of narcissistic power, and yet you can see it kind of in between the lines that there's this underlying sense of a deep ontological insecurity that's creating the hot air, if you will, of his mirage image of being secure in himself.
So by ontological there, you mean what their actual being is? Is that what you mean by that?
Being, yes. Right. Do they have a sense of security in being itself, or do they have a sense of security in an egoic display? And how do you tell the two apart? because largely it's you can really fudge a person's circuits, where they think they are perceiving ontological security, and all they are is dealing with the image of it. So that's an area of investigation. I think that would be interesting. I don't have any answers here, but it does seem like a useful thing to tease apart and try and explore, ideally with a more robust lens than what we currently have available to us. So it'd be interesting to see if CogSci could deal with something like the difference that's happening there and what the process is, as one example. Yeah. So yeah, getting into specific system design, I touched on this last time as well. Graduation versus non-graduation. This is really a big problem in spiritually oriented groups, which is there's no graduation process, which has the side effect of you being a perma student. This is also a critique I would squarely level at Vervaeke's project itself, because it has a quality of infinite searching. So this is a good way to bind people into a subservient position. One of the great qualities of a system like college is that you finish and you prove that you've learned what it has to offer, and then you go on and, you know, there's still rules and all that kind of stuff, but you actually go on to, you know, finish your subservient role and become part of the leadership of whatever field that you studied, ideally. So I would say this is a quality of what makes a healthy cultic system, is that you leave it at some point and you go out and interface with the world and deal with the world on your own terms, ideally recreating a kind of a Hegelian synthesis and improving upon what it is that you gained by being part of that system. Likewise, you don't have to actually divorce yourself from the system, right? Colleges have alumni programs. You can come and teach or have guest roles at the college. These are all very useful things. But yeah, that one's a big one, because you know, what does it mean to graduate from a religion? It's confusing, right? Does it mean that you are truly enlightened, or does it mean that, you know, the teacher can't offer you anything more than your own personal investigation? Like, where are the limits here? You know, there's a reason these systems never stay in balance for very long. It's just, yeah, difficult issues to deal with.
Yeah, I mean, like a lot of what John's talking.
At any point here.
A lot of what John's talking about almost is way of life. Like the ecology of practices is a way of life, right? You know, it's not something you ever graduate from, because we're all, you know, it's tuning your brain, right, to optimizing your brain for relevance realization. You know, Right, and that's fine in this autodidactic fashion because it's safe enough. It gets a little trickier when he, for instance, would go through the process of making an actual community with teachers, teaching the ecology of practices, and then asking the question, at what point do the students of that system stop being students? I mean, I guess I see it as, similar to other wisdom traditions where, I mean, you've got the people you've got the students, you have teachers, and people stop being students, but they still do their practice. They're still part of the community. Right. So that's figuring out where that line is important. Many cultic structures you look at do not have a process where you are now equal with the person who taught you. You know, you're just stuck underneath the person that taught you forevermore. And that's where you can get into dangerous territory.
So yeah, coming up with some mechanism for how that works, I think, is an important area of consideration. You know, how much of it is actually just learning the procedural knowledge of what the practice is, and then how much of it is your personal practice? How does that interface with community, and how does that interface with the community's hierarchy? Whew. All I'm doing is creating problems to solve here. I have like zero answers in this realm.
No, can I just add to your last point? So when you say graduation is very good thing, I'm siding with Brad on the point that so there is this learning element or teaching where you kind of get to some level, but then there is also the practice element. So it may be possible that after a point you just keep practicing and cultivating wisdom or whatever you want to call it, without any need to graduate or any need to be in the same kind of student-teacher relationship.
Well,
you just become kind of practitioner.
You have to spread the meme, right? That's the point. You have to spread the meme. Like, there needs to be a new teacher in the next generation. And also...
Yeah, some of the students become teachers, right?
Yeah. I feel the frame is a little bit restrictive if you put it this way, that there has to be a graduation or some kind of final.
Well, I think he's saying that people shouldn't always be in, I guess, this subservient position to the teacher, where at some point they sort of know approximately as much as the teacher. And, you know, even the teacher may be a bit more technical and be able to communicate it better, that the students pretty well have grasped what the teacher has offered. And, you know, so at one point they can say, I'm not a student anymore. I'm not just always in this position under you.
Right. And I mean, you could apply that same logic to college itself. Like, when a person graduates, do they know everything in that field? No, not by any stretch of the imagination. They know maybe a single % of the total body of knowledge that is that field. But there is some level of having achieved a high enough level of proficiency to leave the subservient position and be able to offer something novel onto the field. So how do we mark that transition point, and how does it structure itself when you start dealing with something like the religion that's not a religion project? I mean, if that was not a project, if it was just, here's some practices that work, do whatever you want with them, this would be a lot less of a consideration, I think, for Viveki's thing in particular, at least. Also, Dana, your mouth is moving, but we can't hear you. I don't know if you're talking to us or someone else.
Oh, my sensitivity was too low. I was saying that the religion that's not a religion, at least to me, is a framework for an internal structure that you develop within your own self to kind of, you know, create these structures that do get corrupted. These external structures that we normally had, you know, such as a church or, you know, whatever hierarchy that we would subscribe to. You know, the ecology of practice, where you're your own teacher and your own student. You know, it's a little schizophrenic. You're both, really. So that's how I take the Ridnar thing, at least. But I understand your concern, at least if a traditional sort of system or hierarchy were to evolve out of this, you know, movement.
Well, I would say more than that. Vervaeke himself claims that's the intention of Ritnar. It's not meant to be an autodidactic, here's your journey for yourself. He's trying to bring back.
Has he said that explicitly?
Explicitly, yeah.
Hmm.
Yeah, he finds there's a danger to autodidacticism. That like Hitler was an autodidactic. Look what he did.
I remember I remember John said it could breed narcissism.
Yeah, definitely it could without, the proper checks on it.
My critique of his critique of autodidactism was perhaps something that you would be in line with as well, which is it seems a lot more useful to me to train people how to make use of their autodidactic inclinations rather than to demonize autodidactism.
Well, but remember, like
itself.
he doesn't consider, say, what we're doing here in the Discord as autodidactism.
Yeah,
like
true.
so he just says you shouldn't be doing it on your own. Like you should have a community around you because you can bounce ideas off. They can check you when you're going off.
So here's what if the graduation process is you've developed enough ability that you can go off and start a community of your own. That's what that is, because you got to realize that this is only sustainable up to a certain scale. At least in this intimate of a setting. I mean, shit, we can only get 25 people on video chat anyway. And so it has to be scaled out somehow.
Yep.
Right, and that has to be ritualized, right? Or should
Right.
be ritualized. Because it should be celebrated as well, right?
Put that square hat on and flip your little thing to the other side.
Is that the Amish?
No, that's college.
College? Oh, yeah.
That's college, yeah.
I wouldn't know. Never went. I'm not a didact.
Same.
I just want to draw your
2
attention to
weeks
the
of
time,
higher
Nick.
education.
So just drawing your attention to the time.
Right. Yeah. So okay. Yeah. Isolationist versus consumptive. This is another quality that I've pointed out as a quality of healthy versus unhealthy cults. If your cult requires isolationism to function, it's really bad. That's the eating your own shit, right? Mistaking the product for the I forgot the goofy line to tell people that they're full of shit in a fancy way. So basically, you need a structure that's constantly interfacing with the world as it happens, and I would argue this is also what makes a healthy worldview in a more generalized sense. So you need a cultic structure that consumes the world, processes it, makes sense of it, and then is able to transmute that consumptive process into action. It's literally just modeling it off of our digestive system. You go and consume something that's not you, and combine it with the body, produce energy as a side effect, and turn that into further action. Specializing your language. We've all kind of watched Vervaeke struggle with where the line is on this one. Right, you're forming boundaries by using specialized language. You're also able to create really useful heuristics that condense a huge body of information. You create an internal sense of community by using specialized language, right? Good friends do their goofy handshake or whatever. These are all important factors. They can also be used against, right? They can create an isolationist wall. They can make it so that you can't communicate your ideas well with people unfamiliar with your system. So perhaps doing both in this case would be a good way to do it. So allow yourself to create that specialized language and also be constantly trying to figure out how you can communicate those ideas in plain language also. So, right, this is something, for example, Jordan Peterson was very helpful for religious people, was that he broadened the vocabulary and was able to communicate religious or spiritual ideas in a language that was suited for people that were not open to those forms of language. So playing with those realms, I think, is important. Yeah, apocalyptic myths and their prevalence, how they can be used to shift our Overton window, and also why we can't do without them. So this is just a really interesting quality, but like across the board, regardless of whether a group is spiritual or not, there is this insistence on apocalyptic myths. So whether it's, you know, dealing with politics and bringing in the nuclear age as part of it, if you're into ecosystem activism, then you're bringing in global warming. You know, obviously all the religions have their really intense apocalyptic myths. I think a large part of what creates this prevalence is that apocalyptic myths are how we project our own death onto the world and then attempt to deal with it. And in that sense, they are extremely healthy. They are because literally all of us will experience the apocalypse. It's just whether it's also the apocalypse for everyone else at the same time or just for you. Right? It's a matter of degree, not of quality. So realizing that that's there, that it's also a necessary feature, coming to terms with death and the process by which we do so, and then also being aware of how that can be misused against us to shift our Overton window and make us think that certain behaviors are now allowable because of a certain context. You know, again, trading off between advantages and disadvantages here. But yeah, I don't think you'll be able to get away with any type of worldview that does not have some type of apocalyptic structure to it. So then the question becomes, how do you make use of it effectively? Yeah. Sorry, I'm trying to run through. We again have gone for far longer than I intended. So
Part 4.
Part 5.
Yeah.
Part 5.
Yeah, no, I can't do any more.
More.
So yeah, purity cults and inverse purity cults. I kind of went over this earlier, talking about how like some of the advantages and disadvantages, the integrating the shadow, arguably what the left was doing through like the 80s and 90s, right? You had like, the left is probably not a good term here, but the counterculture, the artistic counterculture of the time, doing things like Piss Christ and arguably the dawning of postmodern art was like an inverse of a purity cult. So it was literally trying to dirty the world, destroy the purity symbols, or put them in a context where they're symbols of an absolute lack of purity. This ties into Gnosticism as well. The Gnostic drive, I would argue, is characterized more than anything by the desire for a pure state. So whatever realm that happens in does not have to be spiritual, right? It could be a type of moral purity like we're seeing on the far left right now, lacking any metaphysics or supernatural element. Again, the eco activists, that's very much a type of purity cult, or can be characterized as such, quite literally, with pollution as the big bad guy there. You're going to end up trading off between things. The problems of purity cults are well known. They lead to repression. You end up with things like the Catholic priest scandal, Among other issues, extreme dogma and fundamentalism come with purity cults. Inverse purity cults, also extraordinarily dangerous, right? Practicing sexual tantra with your guru has famously created many issues. Your ability to decipher what is good from what is bad, or what is healthy from what is unhealthy, goes out the window in inverse purity cults. You can endless examples of that. Sex with the guru being instant transmission, but then it ends up the guru just wants to fuck a bunch of young women. Right, the Hindu cults where they meditate so deeply on death that they're eating rotting carcasses of humans to prove that everything is the same, or to induce it as an experience. Yeah, it's just which class of error do you want to make, and how do you aim for the center if there is one, and how do you keep it balanced? All important questions to ask oneself. Creating a strong idea of the difference between dependency, independency, and codependency. There's so much to say there that I'm just going to leave it at that. A critique of relevance realization I threw in here, which is this. I brought it up earlier in the chicken or egg problem of, like, you can't actually tell who's a good teacher until you could be the teacher. Yeah, so, like, developing discernment without any yeah, I don't know how to parse this. So I have like 3 more problems you guys could meditate on, or we could get to some questions and conversation.
Problems, please.
Problems, okay.
Nick, do you think that John's reflections on the origins of the sacred shed some light on, or dovetails with your meditations on, cultish? It seems like he made a link, and it's fuzzy to me, but to the sacred originating in something like a childhood or childlike imprint. I'm using that word imprint, and I'm thinking of like the way a duckling is
right.
Imprints on when it hatches. And that leaves such a mark at one's proximity to that re-encounter with that sort of places the individual in touch with their most original sense of the sacred, or in a way that's experienced as indisputable.
Right. It's a little tricky because Vervaeke, now I'm just getting into opinions here, so we're shifting categories slightly. Vervaeke does the move where he tries to throw sacredness out, or he tries to throw the sacred out altogether and replace it with sacredness. And in many ways, I've tried to map that in my own sense-making onto the ground of being pursuit versus being. So in that sense, I can understand why he would describe sacredness in the terms of a type of childhood, a childlikeness. In the sense that I think sacredness is more directly tied to the oceanic experience. And then the sacred, I would argue from my own experiences, is what happens following the experience of sacredness. And that's like, from the oceanic experience, you can finally see what differentiation is and how beautiful it is within the proper context. So yeah, as far as like tying that back to cultic structures, this is a weird one because I almost get the sense that cultic structures are how these things limp, right? They make the pursuit available, but they don't offer anything unto the pursuit in some very deep sense. And that would be almost following on like Kierkegaard and Tillich, kind of the existentialists, and beyond, if you will. Which is that at some point you have to get, to the God beyond the God of theism. Otherwise, you're stuck always looking at the idol of God and not the icon. And I think that cultic structures fundamentally offer us the idols, and in the very best of them, they afford us the ability to see the icon within the idol, but it is not by any means programmable within a cultic structure. And you see this in all religious traditions, right? It's like you see it in Buddhism as well. Like the last thing you have to throw away is enlightenment itself. Like you cannot become enlightened by trying to become enlightened. Right? In some deep sense, you'd see it in Christianity, in the failure of work. Right? At some point, you need grace. You have to release work in order to be afforded grace. The issues with that have been made very obvious by various Protestant theologians. Calvin, of course, taking it to its furthest conclusion. Yeah, so I don't know. Did I talk on what you were aiming at there, or?
Yeah, I mean, my aim wasn't very narrow or tight. It's just I'm struck by first day of school. So you're freshman in high school or your first day on college campus, and there's a mode of being that's extremely porous and highly imprintable. And
Right.
so it seems like in that state, those encounters have such a deep resonance that they can reverberate down through the years.
Right.
I hear people tell war stories 50 years later, and they have the whole life to talk about, but what they reminisce on is that day they were in a foxhole in that cold winter storm, and
Right.
it without lifting a finger, they suffered or underwent a revelation that marked them or imprinted them or characterized them. So there's something about the cult or the sacred where each of us is getting nailed in a way. And,
Right. Well,
and there's something about us that wants to be nailed.
Right. And I might differentiate there. I mean, it really depends on kind of the lens we're using, but it's like, the military is the cult that afforded the experience in the foxhole, right? And part of that was like the extreme training, the growing of brotherhood between a squadron or whatever, right? It has all these systems that enable that scenario to reach its peak experience of meaning or reality. But the cultic structure itself did not offer the experience. It was instead what allowed the contextualized the experience. So you get kind of both affecting each other in a very deep sense, right? Vervaeke's interpenetration, which very suggestive language.
I thought the same thing when he said wants to be nailed.
I'm used to it from semi-rational there.
Yeah, this is a great conversation. Thanks for doing this again, by the way, Nick.
Yeah, absolutely. don't know if you want your name on the internet or not. Well, now I can't reference you. I feel awkward. Okay. Should we answer some of these that have built up in...
Sure.
In,
So Elu, who's not here right now, had a comment. I also spent 2 years in a cult from 18 to 20. The governance structure was alleged to be one of consensus-based decision-making, but ultimately the lack of information flow throughout the community enabled those in control of information to leverage their expertise to control things. Example, we defer to the finance guy on finances, etc. There was a lot of social control and eroding of individuality, and general exploitation. It was ultimately shut down by the state as historic abuse was uncovered.
Whoa.
It is more of a comment.
Yeah. Wow, I wish I could talk to him to get more of what that experience was like. But just on the surface, this is that type of thing where it's like, you know, you think you've come up with a rock solid structure system that's gonna, you know, work well, and it's the levels. This is like what I try and talk about with the naivety of people. It's like thinking that you're gonna be able to design the one system that does not corrupt horrifyingly in all of human history. It's like if there was an answer to this question, we would all be living in the utopia, and we would have gotten here 100,000 years ago. So it's...
I think you underestimate Mark.
Maybe so. So yeah, again, I don't know like a way around that than checks and balances, thinking that, you know, you've dodged the problem because you've created a system, a healthy system of a meritocracy or whatever that's not going to corrupt, or I don't know, man. I don't know. It's a really intense set of problems. Probably the safest to some degree is... There's a reason we're an individualist culture, and it's like individualism is so safely ineffective that it allows people to like live off the meager scraps of meaning without a lot of the dangers that come with partaking in these larger social structures, and we have not come up with a good answer for that. So it's not to say we should not be trying. It means we should be extraordinarily skeptical in our ability to actually do so.
Well, and also very aware, you know, try to be very mindful of, are we succeeding in what we're trying to accomplish, and, you know, what is the actual practical effect of what we're doing.
Right.
So, Adam had a question, but I'm not sure if it's
it's hard to talk more on that one without them in.
Well, maybe we'll see if talk to Elu. Maybe Elu will want to come and share a bit of their experience on another day.
Yeah. Get a cult. There's like 3 or 4 of us that have, maybe more, that have pretty intense cult experience. So we could get like a.
for obvious reasons. I mean, learning from your guys' experience is very important to me, and I know a lot of people here. You know, we want to avoid that. There is the danger here, and we're aware of it, and we want to. So learn from other mistakes. Adam had a question, but I think it's a bit of a joke. Sorry. Did you want to? Yeah.
Oh, I was just going to throw in as well.
Very serious.
I was just going to throw in as well to your point there, Brett, just that, you know, it's even, I mean, yes, it's highly salient in a group like this one, where it has an emphasis on transformative community and also is trying to create a religion that's not a religion. But I would also argue like it's just increasingly prevalent across the board as people starving for meaning, you know, it seems clear to me that postmodernism ends in something like a whole hell of a lot of cults. And I don't see a clear way out of that.
Yeah.
And that seems to be happening. So at various levels, that seems to be happening. So yeah, it's all very important stuff. People that have experienced the kind of extremes of these realms, learning from what they have experienced, I think is really important.
So Yana's not here, but she had
outside of this.
But she had a question. Can you tell us more about the people that were part of the cult? What kind of reasons did they have for ending up there? And can you say something about the difference between people who stayed there and the ones that were able to leave?
Right. Oh, we skipped Adam. Coolest cult of all time. I don't know. There's been I don't know. I'll probably just blanket answer with my religion to dodge the question. So Christianity is the coolest cult of all time.
That's epic.
Okay, so Yana's question. Yeah, so type of people that were in the cult. There's often the caricature that people that join cults are like, you know, really screwed up to begin with, or have some type of heavy thing that makes them open or overly suggestible. In my experience, that's not particularly true, and like a lot of the sometimes that's the case, like the person was at a really heavy transitional phase in their life, and then you just get these like miraculous aligning of circumstances where the person, you know, gets funneled in at just the right moment. It's probably why the J-dubs are so successful at bringing people in. It's just like, if you knock on someone's door constantly, eventually you're going to find the guy that was having a midlife crisis that day, you know, and takes it as a sign from God that you knocked on their door, whatever. So yeah, there was some level of like going through a heavy transition point. In general, though, there was not a clear commonality on the people that I saw in those circumstances. For people that started the cults, there was a lot more of a clear sign, and that's that they went through some extreme transition that resulted in them believing they'd come to an answer, as opposed to leaving them in the kind of mired ground of chaos that most people end up in when going through transformative experiences. And then they tried to share that message, usually not with the intention of creating a cult, and then a cult forms around it as they try and teach whatever it is they learned through that experience. Sometimes it's more overt, like the person was like, you know, the normal way of living sucks. I'm gonna go build this badass farm and just invite people I like to it. And then it gets weird as they try and navigate problems in a novel way and realize, you know, they end up doing the whole thing. It's such a broad phenomena. I don't know how to quite answer this question. As far as the difference between people who stayed and those that were able to leave, a lot of that came down to sunk investment, and then that combined with just the novel circumstances of the person's life at that exact moment in time. You know, for me, what enabled me to break off from the one that I was like really in, because the others were fairly easy to leave, was the yellow and red flag system that I told you guys about in the last one. And I had like let a number of yellow flags slide until I got to a point where I could see myself recreating a situation that I had experienced earlier that was very traumatizing for me. And so that was like what kicked me out. And even then, I did so with like zero security in my decision. Like, I did not know if, you know, the red flags that I thought were red flags were actually red flags, or if I was just building it up in my head, right? I just couldn't tell. And given enough time, I was proven correct. But
that's probably
you know,
a useful project for us.
That's why I put so much... Oh, go ahead.
I would say that's probably a useful project for us, is to put together a list of these yellow and red flags for us to
Right.
keep in mind. Especially from my part in sort of organizing all this, and for people to watch out, to say, hey, maybe we're going too much in this direction, in this negative direction. So that might be
Right.
that's something we should work on.
And it is like, it's hard to overemphasize how important that type of system is. Again, especially when you're entering into an exploratory state, dealing with a novel worldview or cultic structure. Like, you will lose your normal mechanisms for telling one thing from another.
Mm-hmm.
Like, you necessarily will lose those, especially if it's doing any type of effective work on you at all. If it's totally ineffective, then yeah, you're probably fine, and you're also getting nothing from it. So yeah, that one is, I really think it is really important, and it also, I think, is a good practice for getting a person to learn how to trust themselves while affording them a legitimately and truly and deeply exploratory state. So balancing those two things as usual. Yeah.
So
I don't have anything else there.
I wish she was still here, because I'd like to hear a little more about this question. But Lemurian Light Crystal asks, a common superficial assessment of this Discord server by people I've invited here is that it is culty. What can we do to change this? Now, I'd like to hear a little bit more about what the specific comments were, obviously. But, I think we tried not to be. But
specialized language and the upfront cost of 50 hours of lectures from a single person, I would say, would set off most people's sense. More so than anything else, I would imagine. If I was coming into this in a novel situation, that's probably what would trigger my perception.
So I mean, this is a bit of a rock and a hard place, because I think the educational aspects of that course, I think, are pretty darn important for, like if we want people to not just trust us to say, that, hey, this is what we're doing because it's good, to say, hey, this is why we're doing it. So without going through the course, you don't have any idea of that unless you have your own background and all the stuff. But the vast majority of people probably don't. But yeah, it can seem daunting. I wonder if we should create just a shorter version of it for people. But this is a tough problem.
The intro is a legitimate intro. Like, people can watch the first video in the series and at least get an idea. And when I pointed those out, I didn't mean to argue that we should do something to change them. At some level, there is like a self-selection pressure that's probably actually useful. So, can we see the cat? Oh,
I second this.
Yeah, I think, Brett, the fundamental problem, to Nick's point, is, for all intents and purposes, we are a cult, right? We have all of the credentials, because cults are these things that are everywhere. And so the question is, how do you get people interested and involved without thinking that they're going to get trapped? Because the meditation traditions do the same thing, right? We're gonna get you enlightenment. Just get some vocabulary and come on. We don't give you the vocabulary. Read the book. It's fine. And the next thing you know, I mean, that's Dianetics. That's how people get into Dianetics, right? They read the book.
Well, I guess
it's got all custom language.
There's also, Nick's definition of cult's a little broader. I think the question, or this is culture, the way I was just referring to it, is in more the negative sense of, like Nick has the positive cult and the negative cult. The idea is at least to avoid the negative being the negative one. Although I'm not convinced that cult is a word that's worth saving at this point. That it's been tarnished pretty well, and it has a negative connotation that I think we're kind of stuck with for a while. And I think trying to
try
to save the term would be distrustful to people. You know, I think they would think, oh, why are they trying to save the word cult? They're probably because they're a cult. You know. But,
yeah. Well, the other option is you go the normal proselytizing route, and then you're just consumed with making sure your thing isn't a cult when it obviously is. Yeah, but I take the criticism. It's obvious, you know, it's brought up a lot. That's why I try and use cultic structure to like strip it from some of its connotation while trying to get people to be more aware. But I think there is, at some level, there's a point where the gut punch, I think, is useful. Or the frame break. You know, I think everyone talking about how everything is tribal nowadays is not... It's just dodging what is actually happening. And it's doing so in a way that does not give us very useful tools for dealing with the scenario.
Well, I have thoughts on that, but that's another conversation.
Not recovering the word is...
Yeah. But I mean, so I think, I mean, yeah, obviously, whether we call it, I would certainly not want people to associate this with the negative type of cult if they're going to associate it with cult at all. And I mean, one idea we played with is, you know, creating the aspirant role. So there's the easy barrier of entry of just anybody can come in and take part and sit with us and all that. But then for those who want to go deeper, you know, and make more of a commitment, you know, maybe they're the people who will commit to watching the whole series, for example, and, you know, to following the ecology of practices and things like that. Those are, you know, ideas floating around right now.
Right. And that's going to greatly increase the perception of it being culty.
Yeah. I mean, on the other hand, you do want people to have a more invested role, I think.
Absolutely.
So it's, yeah, I mean, it's a rock and a hard place. It's
yes. At some point, that's what I'm trying to say as well, is like at some point you just kind of go, you accept what it is you're actually attempting, you become very aware of the dangers and risks, and then you start playing with the dynamics, because if you want it to work or have any chance of doing anything, you're going to have to play with those dynamics eventually.
Right.
So then we have conversations like this and try and deal with the dangers. But yeah, as far as playing like a PR game of things that look culty, and, you know, it's like, I don't know how effective that is. I'm far more concerned with, is there any actual abuse or negative impact on the people that are participating, than I am with what's its public relations, you know, face.
Right. And I think what part of the answer is, I mean, like, I'd like, you know, if there are people who think, oh, this is really culty or whatnot in the negative sense, you know, I'd certainly like to talk to them. Or my suggestion would be, hey, hang out and tell us what you think after that. And if you have issues, I mean, if people have these negative ideas, I'd like to know about them, because maybe it's something we have to counter. You know, it may be, there may be legitimate things. I mean, I think we've done a pretty good job of being very open, and you know, I know John, is definitely, like, he's very humble. He doesn't want to be like the whole leader figurehead. He wants other people involved. Part of our mandate is to, you know, go with other groups, you know, coordinate with other groups, and that's what we've been trying to do as well. You know, be in conjunction with science, which I think is very, which is by definition dynamic, you know, because science is always changing. So practices will always change if we want to be in accordance with the best science.
Right. I mean, at this point, I don't think this Discord is strong enough. Like, yeah. If people are responding that way, then they're probably not going to get much out of the situation anyways.
Well, that's what I'm wondering, if it's just people who just came in, looked around, and then left, versus people who hung out for a while. I'd be more concerned of people who hung out for a few days and then left because they thought it was culty, versus someone who just came in, sniffed around.
Right,
and then...
the initial. So that, yeah, we should probably have a chat with Lemurian Light Crystal.
Yeah.
I can't tell if that name is ironic or not. But yeah, to see, to get more information on that specific topic.
Can I add something?
Oh.
Yeah.
So, when I got out of that cult in the UK I was in, I found the checklist published by a UK charity who deals with like families of people who disappeared in the cult. And it's like 21 points which are like cultic, like negative cultic structures usually have. And this includes things like sleep deprivation and diet restrictions and like not like disorienting people by not telling them what time it is, this kind of stuff, or like not being able to just leave physical premises. So I can look that up, but it sounds similar to Nick's yellow red flag kind of system.
Right.
So I'm saying, and following up on this, you mentioned this kind of dichotomies. Like, is it open, isolated, or is it open? So I wonder how would you assess what we do here on those measures? Because I feel this community is open, and John is obviously a public figure, and everyone can see what he is doing. So there is nothing secret or kind of unsavory going on behind closed doors.
No. I would say this is very open, and then there's pseudo boundaries formed from investment cost. Right, investment in this case being a lot of time and brain power to understand the Vervaeke's lecture and where he's coming from that contextualizes the server. That's not a real boundary. The only other point would be that consumptive aspect of like how much does the community use the tools available to it to contextualize the world, right? Is it isolating away from the world and trying to escape reality, or is it dealing with it directly? And in that regard, I would also say it has a pretty high status of interfacing with the world as it's happening, largely through the conversations Vervaeke has with guests, and then also the conversations we have here on the
Well, it's also baked into the ecology of practices themselves, which are designed not to give you the answer, but to help you be better able to figure out your answers, to figure out what's most relevant in your life. And rather than saying, this is the thing that's relevant for everybody, you should all do this. It's teaching you how to have more chances of being having insight or being able to make break frame better, to problem solve better. So rather, it's not giving you the answer, it's giving you sort of a way to help get you better answers on your own.
Yeah, I mean, part of that I would say is a good move, and part of it I think is that might be a byproduct of having an extraordinarily small community. When it gets to the point of, like, there's a difference between this Discord and a legitimate Ritnar, and when you get into the question of like what's a legitimate, religion that's not a religion, I think a lot of what we're talking about here will be a lot more prevalent, or more relevant things to contend with.
So we're coming up to the end, but Jay Davids had a couple questions on sort of the religion's not a religion. Maybe should it have curriculum and exams and prerequisites and admission criteria, I think John's idea is eventually, at least for some of his things, to have. I mean, he's doing courses. I mean, Waking from the Meaning Crisis is kind of a course. He's doing the meditation course. There aren't exams, but I mean, eventually, I guess you could have classes and teachers, teaching the ecology of practices, and people having to show a certain number of hours or skills to pass.
Yeah. This is probably more. This is like getting more hands-on in terms of like community development. It is interesting. You were bringing up the aspirants idea. That might be like, we've watched whatever X amount of time of his content and have a clear idea of the ideas being discussed, and practitioner where people are regularly, participating in the ecology of practices, etc., etc. But yeah, unpopular indeed. They set off people's trigger warnings outside of deeply accredited systems. Yeah, this Jamie Wheel video, I didn't watch the video, I read his article. There's some good stuff in there. Some of it I would push back slightly against, but not heavily. And then I would also make sure to say I don't trust Jamie Wheel himself as far as I could throw him. So...
I haven't seen it, so I won't comment on that. So, wow, this is...
I probably don't want to say that. I don't know. Yeah. I have very subtle little triggers in my head when I watch Jamie.
So this is not the official position of this Discord.
Yeah, I don't mean to be
our guests' opinions are solely the opinion of the guests and do not represent the Awakening from the Meaning Crisis Discord. So...
And the knuckleheads that post there are also not officially voiced. Just a knucklehead from Portugal. And shit.
Right. So your goal was to do this a little shorter, and we finished 5 minutes before 2 hours. So we achieved the goal. The last one went even over 2 hours. So I think so we did it. Well, this has been amazing, and it's actually, I mean, the fact that you could take the time and spread it out over over 6 hours is amazing. I mean, I think we got so much more out of it because of that. So yeah, our deepest thanks there, Nick. That's been great, and I think it's just the beginning, honestly, of this conversation. I think as Lemuria's question highlights, this is something that we need to be very vigilant on, and whether you call it a cult or not, we don't want to be a bad cult. And
right.
Yeah,
and I try and make it clear, like, I'm not advocating that everything calls itself a cult. I'm trying to advocate for like a sociological lens that pushes a little bit closer towards our phenomenology. So I'm trying to incorporate honesty as an ideal when dealing with sociology, and then playing with it from there. I'm not saying like this is what it is, so everyone should call itself that. But being aware that you are dealing with cultic structures, I think, is important.
Well, thank you again. This has been great. Thank you for all the questions, and there's a lot to take in. So, yes, very much appreciated.
Thanks, Nick. Thanks, Brett.
Yeah, it was great. Thank you.
Absolutely. You should hit up some of the other folks that have been talking about some of their cult experience. They might
definitely
have some novel
will.
Points and sense-making that I don't have. So.
Yeah, we might want to set up an actual panel on that, like they have at some of the science fiction conventions, right? Some of the other conventions, they have panels. And we could set up a panel and run a panel. So that might be interesting.
Cult convention panel.
Well, we could set up panels on all kinds of topics, right? But yeah, that would be the first one, since we seem to have so